I got another what if for you tonight. You want to change one moment in the history of this sport to send shockwaves throughout the entire sport? I want to take you back to 2005, I guess it would have been. There's a recruitment going on. I would say even to this day, including Arch Manning. It's the highest profile recruitment in college football history. Who am I talking about, kids? That would be Timothy Tebow of Nice High School. Tim Tebow is down to Florida and Alabama. And at the time, that is a brand new Urban Meyer versus Mike Shula at Alabama in the recruitment of the number one player and number one quarterback in the country. This was, I cannot convey in strong enough terms for those of you in high school right now, my early college audience. In other words, if you just weren't old enough to have gone through this and known what you were watching, I cannot convey to you in strong enough terms what this did for college football and college football recruiting. This took a cottage industry and put it on the map nationally. The Tim Tebow recruitment, I think, is the biggest single recruitment in the history of the recruiting industry, because up until then, some hardcore people were into it. Like folks like us would have already been into it. This got folks who say the word offseason involved in college football recruiting. This got folks who waited until fall to open up a newspaper and say, let's see who we got on the team this year. They followed Tim Tebow's recruitment and then registered at rivals.com and scout.com afterwards. I mean, this is pre-24/7. This is a different world, but this kind of made the world that we live in today. Tim Tebow, on National Signing Day, commits to Urban Meyer and the Florida Gators. I'll ask you a question many people have asked before, and I've got my thoughts on it. What if he would have chosen Alabama? This was neck and neck. There was no fill in the blank and it's not close. There was no, oh, it was always going to be Florida. This was neck and neck. From the horse's mouth, neck and neck. The first thing that I think about when I think about the what if with Tim Tebow, if he goes to Alabama, I'll get to all that in a second. What would it have done for Florida? Everyone wants to go to Saban immediately. I go to Urban Meyer. Urban Meyer had not won a national championship yet. He had Chris Leak at Florida. He was about to win one in 2006, and Tebow was a part of that team. And he played some, but it didn't really become his team until the next year. Would things still have worked out as they did without Tim Tebow? Think about writing the history of Florida football minus Tim Tebow. You're looking at, I think, probably the most famous college football player in our generation. And even if you disagree with that, certainly right there in the top 5. So if I remove him, I take down the statue down there. I don't know which championships I remove. Who knows? Maybe they would have recruited over him and they would have been just fine. It's hard to think they would have seamlessly gone about their business minus a generational player. That's the first thing I think about. The impact on a major program at Florida and what it does for Tim Tebow. Does Dan Mullen, just think about the offensive coordinator there, does Dan Mullen end up garnering the attention that he ended up garnering for just being associated with that? And he was a big part of it, obviously. That's the first thing I think about. Second thing, what does it do for Bama? You know where I'm going with this. This is why it sends shockwaves beyond just the program at Florida. As I said, it's Mike Shula in Alabama at the time. And it was a very interesting time in Crimson Tide football. They were coming off this 10-win season, I believe, in 2005, a regular season. They may have won the bowl game and won 11. So they had their best team they had had in a while, but they got later in the year, and it was pretty clear Alabama was not on the level of USC or Oklahoma or Texas that year, but they were kind of in that next tier. But people were thinking, hey, maybe Mike Shula's finally rounding the program into form. Well, by 2006, it was obvious, no. It was kind of a blip on the radar screen, and he's out, so they fire him after the 2006 season, and they hire a guy by the name of Nick Saban. That's how history ended up going. If Tim Tebow commits to Alabama, that is not how history would have gone. I have a strong suspicion a player the caliber of Tim Tebow would have been good enough to come in right behind Brody Crowell and then start immediately. And secondly, I have a suspicion they would have won enough games for Mike Shula, the guy responsible for landing him, to maintain his employment there in Tuscaloosa, which means when Mal Moore flies down to meet with Wayne Huizenga, the owner of the Miami Dolphins, Scratch that, because it doesn't happen, because he's not firing a coach, therefore he doesn't have a job to offer Nick Saban. Where does Nick Saban end up? Where does he end up? Tebow has a direct impact on this. Because I think Saban would have come back to college. I don't think he was going to stay in Miami. He may have been there the next season, but I don't think he was just going to remain in the NFL. I think he was coming back to college. Where was he coming back to? Because there was no previous tie with Alabama. Alabama just happened to be the job that was open and the one that made the sense for him to take at the time. It could have just as easily been Michigan or LSU again. Florida could have been Georgia. He would have taken any of those. None of those happened to be open at the time. But think about that. You want to send a shockwave through the sport. The better part of the last 2 decades at this point, 15 years, 16 years, they've been defined by either Alabama's going to win the title or someone had to beat them to win the title. It's been that way every year. Heisman trophies, national championships, conference championships, first-round draft picks, more of those than losses. I erase all that. Potentially with a different outcome in one recruitment. I think that you could make the argument that changing that moment potentially changes as much about this sport as any singular moment you could change in the modern era. You're talking about obviously not like changing integration or anything like that in a bygone era, but as far as it comes to plays or individual moments, it's hard to argue that there's one that maybe changes more things than that, because then you could also think about how many coaches have lost their jobs because they couldn't beat Saban. You can think about how many coaches' careers have been made for coaching under Saban. How do I know all that still would have happened? I don't, because a lot of it wouldn't have. Whew. So yeah, you see quickly how this exercise can get out of control.
Thanks for watching, guys. Don't leave yet. Don't leave yet. Make sure you like the video and please subscribe to the channel. Not just for me, that's how we keep this entire thing free.